The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Artisan Grounds, casting golden rectangles across the polished concrete floor. Marcus Chun moved behind the espresso machine with the quiet efficiency of someone who had found rhythm in routine. His hands, steady and precise, guided the steam wand through its familiar dance, creating the perfect microfoam that regular customers had come to expect without even realizing it. At 34, Marcus possessed the kind of understated presence that made people feel comfortable without quite knowing why. His dark hair was always neatly trimmed, his apron spotless despite the morning rush that had just subsided. There was something in his eyes, a depth that suggested he had seen more of life than his current position might indicate, though he never spoke of it. The coffee shop occupied the ground floor of a gleaming downtown tower, serving the city's business elite their daily fuel. Marcus had worked here for 2 years now, ever since Emma started second grade and needed the stability of his consistent schedule. The job paid enough to cover their small apartment 6 blocks away, and more importantly, it allowed him to pick her up from school every afternoon at 3:15. He glanced at the clock above the register. 9:47. In exactly 3 minutes, David Hartwell would walk through the door, order his usual double-shot cordial with oat milk, no sugar, and barely acknowledge Marcus's existence. The routine had been unchanging for 8 months, ever since the tech billionaire had started frequenting Artisan Grounds instead of the Starbucks across the street. Marcus began preparing the cordial before the door chimed. Some might call it presumptuous, but he had learned to read people's patterns long before he started pulling espresso shots. The skill had served him well in his previous life, though that felt like a different person entirely now. The door opened with its familiar electronic chime, and David Hartwell entered as predicted. Tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair that spoke more to stress than age, he moved with the controlled urgency of someone perpetually running late for something important. His custom-tailored navy suit probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor with expensive precision. But it was the small things that Marcus noticed, the details that others missed. The way David's left hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for his phone. The slight downturn at the corners of his mouth that had deepened over the past few weeks. The fact that he had lost weight, his collar now loose around his neck in a way that suggested the change was recent and unintentional. David approached the counter without looking up from his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with mechanical repetition. Marcus had the cordial ready, perfectly crafted with a delicate leaf pattern in the foam that few customers ever noticed, let alone appreciated. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said, his voice carrying the warm professionalism that made customers feel valued without being intrusive. "Your usual cordial." David's response was a grunt of acknowledgement as he placed a $20 bill on the counter, still absorbed in his phone. He never waited for change from the $18 tip, a generosity that might have seemed kind if it didn't feel so dismissive. Marcus had long since stopped pointing out the excessive gratuity, understanding that for men like David Hartwell, throwing money at situations was often easier than genuine interaction. As David turned to leave, Marcus noticed something new. A slight pause in the man's step, a moment of hesitation that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but felt significant in its rarity. David's reflection caught in the window, and Marcus saw something in his expression that made his chest tighten with recognition. The door chimed again as David departed, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Sadness, perhaps, or the particular weight that comes with carrying burdens alone. Marcus wiped down the espresso machine, his movements automatic while his mind processed what he had observed. In his previous profession, he had been trained to notice such details, to read the subtle signs that people broadcast without realizing it. The slight changes in posture, the altered breathing patterns, the way someone held their shoulders when the weight of the world pressed too heavily upon them. He shook his head, reminding himself that those days were behind him. He pulled espresso shots now, crafted foam art, and made small talk about the weather. He picked up Emma from school and helped her with homework and tucked her into bed with stories about brave princesses and clever foxes. It was a good life, a peaceful life, and he had made his choice. The door chimed again, admitting Mrs. Patterson, a retired librarian who ordered the same vanilla latte every Tuesday and Thursday. She smiled warmly at Marcus, her eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine pleasure at seeing him. "How are you today, dear?" she asked, settling her purse on the counter with careful precision. "And how is that sweet daughter of yours?" Marcus smiled back, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "Emma's doing wonderfully, thank you for asking. She just lost her first tooth yesterday and is convinced the tooth fairy is going to make her rich." Mrs. Patterson laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, the optimism of children. Hold on to that, Marcus. The world needs more people who believe in magic." As he prepared her latte, Marcus found himself thinking about magic and belief, about the way children saw possibilities where adults saw only limitations. Emma still believed her father could fix anything, solve any problem, make any sadness disappear with the right combination of hugs and silly voices. If only it were that simple. The morning continued its familiar rhythm. Lawyers ordering triple shots before court appearances, administrative assistants grabbing pastries for office meetings, a few remote workers settling into corner tables with laptops and the determined expressions of people about to change the world, one email at a time. But Marcus's thoughts kept returning to David Hartwell, to that moment of hesitation, that flicker of something vulnerable in his reflection. Professional instincts, supposedly dormant, whispered warnings that Marcus tried to ignore. He was a barista now, not a counselor. He made coffee, not connections. He had given up the weight of other people's pain when he chose Emma's stability over his calling. Yet some skills, once learned, never truly fade. The ability to see past surfaces, to recognize the signs that someone is drowning in plain sight, to understand that wealth and success often mask the deepest struggles of all. Marcus had left his old life behind, but perhaps his old life had not entirely left him. Where in the world are you watching from? What time is it where you are? There's something universal about these moments of recognition, isn't there? When we sense that someone around us is struggling, even when they wear success like armor. Take a moment to think about the people in your own daily routine. The quiet ones, the regulars, the faces you see but perhaps don't really notice. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply pay attention. The lunch rush was approaching, and Marcus began preparing for the afternoon wave of customers. But in the back of his mind, he counted hours until tomorrow morning at 9:50, when David Hartwell would walk through the door again, carrying whatever burden made his hands tremble and his reflection look so haunted. Marcus had spent 2 years learning to be invisible, to blend into the background of other people's important lives. But some people, he was beginning to realize, were invisible too, hidden behind success and status and the assumption that having everything meant needing nothing. Tomorrow, he decided, he would pay closer attention. Not as a counselor, not as someone trained to help, but simply as one human being noticing another. Sometimes, that was where everything important began. The afternoon sun slanted through Emma's classroom window as Marcus arrived at Riverside Elementary, joining the familiar cluster of parents waiting for dismissal. He checked his watch, 3:12, and smiled at his own punctuality. Some habits from his former life remained useful, even if the context had changed completely. Emma burst through the doors with the explosive energy that only 80-year-olds possessed, her backpack bouncing against her small frame as she scanned the crowd for his face. When she spotted him, her entire expression lit up like sunrise breaking over mountains. "Daddy!" she called, weaving between other children with practiced ease. Her dark hair, so much like his own, had escaped its morning ponytail and hung in cheerful disarray around her shoulders. She crashed into his legs with the full force of her enthusiasm, wrapping her arms around his waist. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Marcus asked, ruffling her hair as they walked toward their modest Honda Civic. The car was 10 years old but reliable, much like everything else in their carefully constructed life. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm getting really good at multiplication tables," Emma announced proudly, skipping alongside him. "And Jenny Martinez brought her hamster for show and tell, and it was so cute, Daddy. Can we get a hamster? Please?" I promise I'll take care of it and feed it every day and clean its cage and everything. Marcus laughed, opening the passenger door for her. We've talked about this, Em. Our apartment doesn't allow pets, remember? But maybe when we find a bigger place someday. Emma buckled her seatbelt with the resigned sigh of someone who had heard this explanation before but refused to abandon hope. She chattered about her day as Marcus navigated the familiar streets home, her voice a bright counterpoint to his own quiet thoughts. Their apartment was on the third floor of a converted Victorian house, modest but clean, with large windows that Emma had decorated with her artwork. Marcus had chosen it specifically for the natural light and the small park visible from their living room. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and more importantly, it was stable. As Emma settled at the kitchen table with her homework, Marcus began preparing their dinner. Spaghetti with marinara sauce, Emma's favorite, accompanied by a simple salad that she would pick at reluctantly. The routine was comfortable, predictable, exactly what they both needed after the chaos that had preceded this chapter of their lives. Tell me about work today, Daddy, Emma said, looking up from her math worksheet. Did you make any pretty coffee pictures? Marcus smiled, stirring the sauce. A few. There was a lady who ordered a cappuccino, and I made her a little heart in the foam. She took a picture of it before she drank it. That's so cool, Emma said, her pencil moving across the page with determined concentration. I want to learn how to do that someday. Maybe you could teach me when I'm older? The simple request hit Marcus with unexpected force. In his previous life, he had helped people process trauma, guided them through their darkest moments, used his training to literally save lives. Now his daughter wanted to learn his current skill set, foam art and coffee preparation, and somehow that felt equally important. Of course, sweetheart. When you're older, I'll teach you everything I know about coffee. What Marcus didn't tell her was how he had spent much of the day thinking about David Hartwell, analyzing the man's behavior patterns with skills he thought he had buried. The slight tremor in his hands, the weight loss, the increasing isolation masked as professional efficiency. In his former profession, these would have been red flags demanding immediate attention. After dinner, as Emma worked on an art project at the coffee table, Marcus found himself researching on his laptop. Not professionally, he told himself, just curiosity. David Hartwell's company, Hartwell Technologies, had been in the news recently. Stock prices fluctuating, a major product launch that had received mixed reviews, rumors of internal restructuring. But it was the personal details that caught Marcus's attention. A brief mention in a business journal about Hartwell's recent divorce, finalized 6 months ago. A society page photograph from 2 years earlier showing him with an elegant woman and 2 teenage children, all smiles and expensive clothes. The same photograph appeared in a more recent article about the divorce settlement, but now it felt like archaeological evidence of a life that no longer existed. Marcus closed the laptop, disturbed by his own investigative instincts. David Hartwell was a customer, nothing more. A man who ordered the same drink every morning and left generous tips while barely acknowledging the person serving him. Marcus had no right to dig into his personal life, no professional obligation to analyze his mental state. Emma looked up from her drawing, a colorful explosion of flowers and rainbows that somehow captured her irrepressible optimism. Daddy, are you sad about something? The question startled him with its directness. Children, Marcus had learned, possessed an uncanny ability to sense emotional undercurrents that adults worked hard to hide. No, sweetheart, I'm not sad. Just thinking about work stuff. You think a lot about work, Emma observed with the matter-of-fact tone she used when stating obvious truths. Maybe you should think about fun stuff instead. Like ice cream or puppies or that new animated movie we want to see. Marcus laughed, closing the laptop and moving to sit beside her on the couch. You're absolutely right. What should we think about instead? Emma launched into an elaborate description of the movie plot, complete with character voices and dramatic gestures. As Marcus listened, he felt the tension in his shoulders ease. This was his real life now, this apartment with its cheerful clutter, this brilliant little girl who saw the world as an endless source of potential adventures. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her favorite stuffed elephant, Marcus stood by her bedroom door watching her peaceful face in the dim light from the hallway. 2 years ago, when Sarah died and his world collapsed completely, he had made a choice. Emma needed stability more than he needed professional fulfillment. She needed a father who was present, reliable, emotionally available. He had been good at his old job, perhaps too good. The intensity of crisis counseling, the weight of other people's traumas, the constant pressure of life and death decisions had consumed him completely. When Sarah's cancer took her away, Marcus realized he had nothing left to give anyone else. His daughter deserved better than the exhausted shell of a man he had become. So he had walked away from psychology, from the credentials and expertise that had defined his identity for over a decade. He learned to make coffee instead, mastered the art of customer service, built a new life centered entirely around Emma's needs. It had been the right choice, the only choice that made sense. But as Marcus finally headed to his own bedroom, he couldn't shake the image of David Hartwell's reflection in the coffee shop window, the haunted expression that lasted only seconds but felt significant in ways Marcus couldn't ignore. Some instincts, apparently, never fully disappeared, no matter how deliberately you tried to bury them. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the city feel alive with possibility. Marcus arrived at Artisan Grounds 30 minutes before opening, using the quiet time to prepare for the day ahead. The ritual of grinding beans, calibrating the espresso machine, and arranging pastries in the display case had become meditative, a series of small tasks that grounded him in the present moment. By 9:30, the morning rush was in full swing. Marcus moved through the familiar choreography of orders, his hands working automatically while his mind processed the subtle dynamics of his regular customers. There was Jennifer from the law firm upstairs, who ordered a triple-shot Americano and always looked like she was running on 3 hours of sleep. Robert from the accounting office, who insisted on a specific ratio of cream to coffee that he never quite explained correctly but somehow Marcus always got right. And then there was David Hartwell, whose pattern had shifted in ways that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. At 9:52, 2 minutes later than usual, David entered the shop. Marcus had his courte-du prepared, but something felt different about the man's presence today. His usually precise movements seemed slightly off balance, and when he approached the counter, Marcus noticed his eyes were slightly bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept well in days. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said, studying the man's face with practiced subtlety. "Your courte-du is ready." David reached for his wallet, but his hands fumbled with the leather briefly before extracting the usual $20 bill. As he placed it on the counter, Marcus saw something that made his chest tighten with recognition. A barely visible mark on David's wrist, partially hidden by his expensive watch, that looked suspiciously like a healing scratch. Professional alarm bells, dormant for 2 years, began ringing in Marcus's mind. In his former career, he had learned to recognize the signs of self-harm, the subtle indicators that someone was struggling with thoughts they couldn't voice. The mark could be innocent, of course, perhaps an accident while gardening or working on some project. But combined with the weight loss, the trembling hands, the increasing isolation, it painted a picture that Marcus found deeply troubling. David pocketed his change without counting it and turned toward the door, but this time he paused near the window, staring out at the street with an expression of profound emptiness. The pause lasted longer than yesterday, nearly 10 seconds of complete stillness that felt heavy with unspoken despair. Marcus found himself wanting to say something, anything, to break through the invisible barrier that surrounded this man like bulletproof glass. But what could he say? "Excuse me, sir, but I used to be a crisis counselor and I think you might be contemplating suicide?" The presumption was staggering, the potential consequences of being wrong equally so. David finally moved toward the exit, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor with mechanical precision. As he reached for the door handle, he turned back briefly, and for just a moment, his eyes met Marcus's directly. In that instant, Marcus saw something that confirmed his worst fears. It was the look of someone who had already said goodbye, who was moving through the world like a ghost waiting for permission to disappear completely. The door chimed, and David was gone, leaving Marcus staring at the empty space where he had stood. The normalcy of the coffee shop continued around him, other customers chatting about weekend plans and complaining about traffic, but Marcus felt suspended in a moment of terrible clarity. He had seen that look before, in the faces of clients who had reached the end of their emotional resources. It was the expression of someone who had calculated the worth of their continued existence and found it wanting. In his previous life, recognizing that look had meant immediate intervention, safety protocols, emergency contacts. Now, it meant nothing more than the uncomfortable knowledge that someone was drowning in plain sight. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine interactions that felt suddenly surreal. Marcus made lattes and cappuccinos, accepted compliments on his foam art, made small talk about the weather, all while his mind raced through possibilities and protocols he no longer had the authority to implement. During his lunch break, Marcus walked to the small park near Emma's school, needing space to think clearly. He sat on a bench under an oak tree that was just beginning to turn golden at the edges, watching office workers eat sandwiches and check their phones. The ordinary scene felt like a different world from the crisis he sensed unfolding in slow motion. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over contacts he hadn't called in 2 years. Dr. Patricia Vance, his former supervisor, who had tried to talk him out of leaving the field. James Miller, a colleague who still worked at the crisis center downtown. Either of them would know what to do, how to handle the ethical complexities of his situation. But calling them would mean crossing a line he had drawn carefully around his new life. It would mean acknowledging that Marcus Chen the barista was still, in some fundamental way, Marcus Chen the crisis counselor. It would mean admitting that some responsibilities transcended career changes and personal boundaries. A group of children ran past his bench, their laughter bright and careless in the afternoon air. One little girl reminded him of Emma, with the same dark hair and infectious energy. Marcus thought about going home to his daughter, helping her with homework, listening to her chatter about hamsters and multiplication tables. That was his real life now, his actual responsibility. David Hartwell was a stranger who happened to order coffee from him. A wealthy, successful man who probably had access to any kind of help he needed. Marcus was projecting, perhaps, seeing patterns that didn't exist, letting his old training create problems where none existed. Professional paranoia, Dr. Vance had called it, the tendency to see pathology everywhere once you'd been trained to recognize it. But as Marcus walked back to work, he couldn't shake the image of David's eyes in that brief moment of contact. He had seen genuine despair there, the kind that didn't respond to money or status or any of the external measures of success that the world used to judge worth. The afternoon shift passed quietly, with fewer customers and more time to think. Marcus found himself planning tomorrow's interaction, wondering if there was some way to extend their brief exchange, to create an opening for connection without overstepping boundaries. He wasn't a counselor anymore, but he was still a human being who recognized suffering in another person. As closing time approached, Marcus began the familiar routine of cleaning and preparation for the next day. But underneath the mundane tasks, he felt the weight of knowledge he couldn't ignore and responsibilities he wasn't sure he still had the right to claim. Tomorrow morning, David Hartwell would walk through that door again, and Marcus would have to decide whether to remain invisible or risk everything to reach out to someone who might be beyond saving. Thursday morning brought an unexpected rain that drummed against the windows of Artisan Grounds, creating a cocoon of warmth and coffee-scented intimacy inside the shop. Marcus watched the water streak down the glass as he prepared for another day, wondering if the weather would affect David Hartwell's routine. Some people became more withdrawn during storms, while others found the gray skies a perfect match for their internal landscape. The morning customers arrived damp and slightly irritable, shaking droplets from their umbrellas and complaining about forgotten raincoats. Marcus served them with his usual efficiency, but part of his attention remained focused on the door, waiting for the familiar figure who had consumed his thoughts since yesterday afternoon. At 9:48, David entered looking worse than Marcus had ever seen him. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled from the rain, but more concerning was the general air of disconnection that seemed to surround him like a visible aura. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each step required conscious effort. Marcus had the courtier ready, but as David approached the counter, something unprecedented happened. Instead of his usual grunt of acknowledgement, David actually spoke. "Is it always this busy in the morning?" he asked, his voice carrying a flat quality that made Marcus's professional instincts scream warnings. "Most weekdays, yes," Marcus replied carefully, studying David's face for any additional clues. "People need their caffeine to face the day." David nodded slowly, as if this simple observation contained profound meaning. He reached for his wallet with movements that seemed almost robotic, mechanical in their precision. But when he placed the $20 bill on the counter, his hand lingered for a moment longer than usual. "Do you ever wonder what the point is?" David asked suddenly, his eyes still focused on the money rather than Marcus's face. "All this rushing around, all this urgency. Where is everyone going that's so important?" The question hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Marcus felt his training kick in automatically, recognizing the philosophical questioning that often preceded serious ideation. People contemplating suicide frequently became preoccupied with existential meaninglessness, viewing the daily activities of others as pointless exercises in futility. "I think people find meaning in different things," Marcus said carefully, his voice carrying the neutral warmth he had learned to project in crisis situations. "Connection with others, accomplishing goals, taking care of their families." David finally looked up, and Marcus saw something in his expression that confirmed his worst fears. It was the look of someone who had already checked out emotionally, who was going through the motions of existence without any real investment in the outcome. "Family," David repeated, the word carrying a bitter edge. "Yes, that's supposed to matter, isn't it?" The pain in his voice was unmistakable now, raw and immediate. Marcus felt the familiar surge of professional instinct, the urgent need to probe deeper, to assess risk level, to implement safety protocols. But he was a barista now, not a counselor, and the boundaries of their interaction were rigidly defined by social convention. "Do you have family, Mr. Hartwell?" Marcus asked, pushing gently against those boundaries while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. "I did," David said simply, picking up his courtier with hands that trembled more noticeably than before. "They're better off without me now." The statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. In crisis counseling, expressions of others being better off without the individual were considered immediate red flags, often indicating advanced suicidal planning. David wasn't just depressed or going through a difficult period. He was actively contemplating ending his life and had rationalized it as beneficial to others. "I'm sure that's not true," Marcus said, his voice carrying more warmth than their previous interactions had warranted. "Families are complicated, but the connections usually run deeper than we realize in difficult moments." David studied him with sudden intensity, as if really seeing him for the first time. "You sound like you know something about difficult moments." The observation was accurate and dangerous. Marcus was revealing too much of his professional background, letting his training show through the careful facade he had constructed around his new identity. But David's condition seemed to be deteriorating rapidly, and the normal rules of engagement felt inadequate to the crisis unfolding before him. "Everyone goes through hard times," Marcus said, attempting to deflect while maintaining connection. "Sometimes it helps to talk to someone about them." David's laugh was hollow, devoid of any real humor. "Talk to someone." "Yes, I've heard that advice before. Pay someone to listen to your problems for 50 minutes and pretend they care about the outcome." The cynicism was typical of someone who had experienced therapy but hadn't found it helpful, often because they had been too guarded to engage authentically with the process. Marcus recognized the defense mechanism, the way people protected themselves from vulnerability by dismissing the entire concept of professional help. "Not all conversations require payment," Marcus said quietly. "Sometimes people care just because they're human." David stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or a momentary crack in the armor of disconnection he had built around himself. But then the moment passed, and the emptiness returned to his eyes. "Thank you for the coffee," David said, turning toward the door with the same mechanical precision as always. But this time, he paused at the threshold and looked back. "You're kinder than most people," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality that made Marcus's blood run cold. "That's rare these days." And then he was gone, leaving Marcus staring at the door with a growing sense of urgency that felt like a timer counting down to something terrible. The casual conversation had revealed far more than David probably intended, painting a clear picture of someone in the final stages of planning their own death. Marcus looked around the coffee shop, at the normal people living their normal lives, completely unaware that they had just witnessed what might have been a goodbye. The weight of knowledge pressed down on him like a physical force, demanding action he wasn't sure he had the right to take. He pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the emergency contact he had programmed 2 years ago and never deleted. Dr. Patricia Vance would know what to do, would understand the ethical complexities and legal requirements. But calling her would mean admitting that Marcus Chen the barista was still, fundamentally, Marcus Chen the crisis counselor. The morning rush continued around him, customers ordering their usual drinks and chatting about weekend plans, while Marcus stood frozen in a moment of terrible decision. Tomorrow was Friday. Something about David's demeanor suggested that weekends held particular significance, perhaps as a time when the absence of work routine made the emptiness more unbearable. Marcus had less than 24 hours to decide whether to break his own carefully constructed boundaries and risk everything to save a man who might not want to be saved. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table long after Emma had gone to bed, staring at a blank piece of paper while his laptop hummed quietly beside him. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, matching the restless rhythm of his thoughts. He had spent the afternoon researching, driven by a professional compulsion he could no longer deny. David Hartwell's divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, but the proceedings had dragged on for nearly 2 years. Court documents, available through public records, painted a picture of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. His ex-wife Rebecca had been awarded primary custody of their twin daughters, now 15, along with the family home in Westchester and a substantial financial settlement. The business news was equally troubling. Hartwell Technologies had been hemorrhaging money for the past year, a series of failed product launches and strategic missteps that had cost investors millions. The tech industry publications were particularly brutal, with headlines questioning David's leadership and speculating about potential bankruptcy. One particularly vicious article had described him as a once brilliant innovator who had lost his edge. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the information through the lens of his crisis training. David wasn't just depressed. He was a man who had built his entire identity around 2 pillars, family and professional success, and both had crumbled simultaneously. The psychological term was role exit, the devastating process of losing fundamental aspects of self-definition. When it happened gradually, people could adapt. When it happened all at once, the results could be catastrophic. He opened a new browser tab and typed in the address for the crisis center where he used to work. The website looked exactly the same, with its calming blue color scheme and carefully worded information about services available 24 hours a day. Dr. Patricia Vance's name still appeared in the staff directory, listed as clinical supervisor with the same extension he had memorized years ago. Marcus picked up his phone, then set it down again. He repeated this action 3 times before forcing himself to stand up and walk to Emma's bedroom door. She was sleeping peacefully, her stuffed elephant clutched against her chest, her face relaxed in the complete trust that only children possessed. This was his responsibility now. This brilliant little girl who needed stability more than the world needed another crisis counselor. But as he returned to the kitchen, Marcus couldn't escape the image of David Hartwell's empty eyes, the mechanical way he moved through the world like someone already dead. Professional ethics demanded action when someone was in imminent danger, but those ethics belonged to a life he had deliberately abandoned. He pulled out his phone one more time and scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Vance's number. His thumb hovered over the call button for several seconds before he finally pressed it, his heart racing as the phone began to ring. "Marcus?" Patricia Vance's voice carried the same warm authority he remembered, tinged with surprise at hearing from him after 2 years of silence. "My goodness, how are you? How's Emma?" We're both doing well, Dr. Vance. She's 8 now, thriving in school. Marcus paused, unsure how to transition into the real reason for his call. I'm working as a barista downtown, and I have a situation I need to discuss with someone. Professional consultation? Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more focused. Tell me what's happening. Marcus described his interactions with David Hartwell, careful to use only observable behaviors rather than speculation. The weight loss, the trembling hands, the increasingly disconnected effect, and most importantly, the conversations that had revealed classic suicidal ideation patterns. You're absolutely right to be concerned, Dr. Vance said when he finished. Everything you've described suggests someone in acute crisis. But Marcus, you understand the ethical complexities here. You're not currently licensed, you have no therapeutic relationship with this individual, and any intervention would be based entirely on observation rather than assessment. I know the complications, Marcus said quietly. But if I do nothing and something happens? You can't save everyone, Marcus. We talked about this before you left. The weight you were carrying, the way you internalized every client's pain as your personal responsibility. That's part of what led to your burnout. The words stung because they were true. Marcus had always struggled with boundaries, with the ability to separate his professional obligations from his personal guilt. When Sarah got sick, when Emma needed him more than his clients did, he had finally learned to choose. But now, faced with someone who reminded him why he had loved the work in the first place, those old patterns felt dangerously compelling. What would you recommend? He asked. Officially? Report your concerns to local law enforcement if you believe someone is in imminent danger. They can conduct a welfare check. Unofficially? Dr. Vance paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes the most powerful intervention is simply human connection. Let him know that someone sees him, that someone cares about his well-being. You don't need a license for basic compassion. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his quiet kitchen thinking about compassion and connection, about the difference between professional intervention and human decency. What part of this story resonates most with you? Share your thoughts about those moments when we recognize suffering in others but feel uncertain about our right or ability to help. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not in therapy offices but in everyday interactions where one person simply acknowledges another's pain. He picked up the pen and began writing, his hand moving across the paper with surprising certainty. The note would be simple, direct, free of any language that could be construed as professional advice. Just one human being reaching out to another in a moment of recognized crisis. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows as Marcus crafted each word carefully, knowing that tomorrow would bring either connection or catastrophe. David Hartwell would walk through that door one more time, and Marcus would have to decide whether to remain invisible or risk everything to save a man who might already be beyond saving. Outside, the city slept under its blanket of rain, unaware that in a small apartment above a flower shop, a former crisis counselor was preparing to break 2 years of carefully maintained boundaries for the sake of a stranger who ordered cortados and carried the weight of the world in his empty eyes. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the rain having washed the city clean during the night. Marcus arrived at Artisan Grounds with the folded note in his apron pocket, its presence a constant weight against his hip as he went through the familiar opening routine. He had rewritten it 4 times before settling on language that felt honest without being presumptuous, caring without being clinical. The morning rush seemed more intense than usual, perhaps because weekend anticipation made everyone move a little faster, speak a little louder. Marcus served the regular customers with automatic efficiency while his mind rehearsed different scenarios for the encounter he knew was coming. Would David be receptive to an unexpected gesture of concern? Would he be offended by what could be perceived as overreach from a service worker? Would he even show up at all? At 9:45, Marcus began preparing the cortado, his hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his system. The familiar ritual of grinding beans and steaming milk helped center him, connecting him to the simple competence he had built in this new life. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he had made his choice based on conscience rather than fear. The door chimed at 9:51, and David Hartwell entered with the same mechanical precision as always. But something was different about his appearance today. His usually expensive suit looked slept in, wrinkled in ways that suggested he might have worn it for more than one day. His hair, normally perfectly styled, showed signs of distracted running of fingers through it. Most concerning of all, his eyes held a glassy quality that spoke of either prescription medication or complete exhaustion. Marcus watched him approach the counter, noting the slight unsteadiness in his gait, the way he seemed to be moving through water rather than air. This was a man in the final stages of psychological collapse, functioning on autopilot while his internal systems prepared for shutdown. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said, his voice carrying more warmth than their previous interactions had warranted. "Your courte-du is ready." David reached for his wallet with movements that seemed to require enormous effort. When he placed the $20 bill on the counter, Marcus noticed that his hands were shaking more noticeably than ever before. The mark on his wrist, partially visible beneath his expensive watch, looked fresh and deliberate. "Thank you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're very consistent." "I appreciate consistency." The comment felt loaded with meaning, as if David was cataloging the reliable elements in his world before letting go of them entirely. Marcus felt the weight of the note in his pocket, the carefully chosen words that might represent the last chance for human connection before something irreversible happened. "Mr. Hartwell," Marcus said, his voice dropping to match David's quiet tone. "I wanted to give you something." He pulled the note from his pocket, his heart racing as he placed it beside the $20 bill on the counter. The folded paper looked insignificant, just a small rectangle of white against the dark surface, but it represented everything Marcus believed about the power of human connection in moments of crisis. David stared at the note for several seconds without touching it, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a mixture of surprise and something that might have been fear. "What is this?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there before. "Just something I wanted you to have," Marcus said, maintaining steady eye contact despite the vulnerability of the moment. "Sometimes people need to know that someone sees them, that someone cares about their well-being." David's hand hovered over the note without picking it up, as if it might contain something dangerous or transformative. The silence stretched between them, filled with the background noise of other customers chatting and the espresso machine cycling through its automated cleaning routine. "You don't know anything about me," David said finally, his voice carrying a defensive quality that Marcus recognized as self-protection. "You don't know what I've done, what I've lost, what I deserve." The words confirmed everything Marcus had suspected about David's internal narrative. Self-blame, shame, and the conviction that his suffering was justified punishment for perceived failures. It was a common pattern among people contemplating suicide, the belief that their pain was earned and therefore couldn't be alleviated through connection or help. "I know you're a human being going through something difficult," Marcus said quietly. "I know you've been coming here every morning for 8 months, and I know you're struggling with something that feels overwhelming right now." David's facade cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of raw pain underneath the carefully maintained composure. His hand moved toward the note, then stopped, as if crossing that distance would represent a commitment he wasn't ready to make. "Why do you care?" he asked, genuine confusion evident in his voice. "You don't know me. You gain nothing from this." Marcus thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her bed, about the life he had built around protection and stability. He thought about Dr. Vance's words about compassion not requiring a license, about the difference between professional intervention and basic human decency. "Because everyone deserves to know that someone sees their worth, even when they can't see it themselves," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had learned these truths through personal experience. "Because suffering in isolation is always worse than suffering with connection." David's eyes filled with tears that he blinked back quickly, his professional composure reasserting itself like armor snapping back into place. But for just a moment, Marcus had seen through to the frightened, exhausted person underneath all the success and status. "I should go," David said, picking up both the note and his courte-du with hands that trembled visibly. "Thank you for the coffee. And for this." He gestured with the note, then tucked it into his jacket pocket without reading it. Marcus watched him walk toward the door, noting that his movement seemed slightly less mechanical than before, as if the simple act of being seen had restored some small measure of humanity to his robotic progression through the world. At the threshold, David turned back one more time, and when he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Marcus," he said, using his name for the first time in 8 months of interactions. "Thank you for seeing me." And then he was gone, leaving Marcus standing behind the counter with his heart pounding and the profound hope that sometimes, in the space between despair and dawn, a single gesture of recognition could make the difference between surrender and survival. The rest of Friday passed in a blur of routine interactions that felt surreal after the morning's intensity. Marcus moved through the familiar choreography of coffee preparation and customer service while his mind replayed every detail of his exchange with David Hartwell. The way David's voice had cracked when he asked why Marcus cared. The tears he had fought to contain. Most importantly, the way he had used Marcus's name, transforming their relationship from anonymous transaction to human connection. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself checking his phone obsessively, though he wasn't sure what he expected to see. David didn't have his number, and even if he did, reaching out would require a level of vulnerability that seemed beyond his current capacity. But the uncertainty gnawed at Marcus like a physical ache, the knowledge that he had introduced an unknown variable into a potentially fatal equation. When 3 o'clock arrived, Marcus left work with unusual reluctance, walking slowly toward Emma's school while his thoughts churned through possible scenarios. Had David read the note? Was he angry at the presumption, or grateful for the connection? Was he even still alive? The last thought hit Marcus like a physical blow, stopping him mid-stride on the sidewalk outside Riverside Elementary. In his previous profession, he had learned that Friday afternoons were statistically dangerous times for people in crisis. The approaching weekend stretched ahead like an empty desert, devoid of the structure and distraction that work provided. If David had been planning something, if the note had somehow accelerated rather than prevented his timeline. Emma's voice cut through his spiral of anxiety like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Daddy. You look worried. Did something bad happen at work?" She stood before him with her backpack slung over one shoulder and her hair escaping its ponytail in the cheerful disarray that marked the end of another school day. Her ability to read his emotional state continued to amaze him, this small person who seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of adult complexity that most grown-ups lacked. "Just thinking about a customer who seemed sad today," Marcus said, taking her hand as they walked toward their car. "Sometimes people carry heavy feelings that are hard to see from the outside." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all discussions about feelings and fairness. "Did you try to help them feel better?" "I tried to let them know that someone cared about them," Marcus said, struck by how simple his intervention sounded when described to an 80-year-old. "Sometimes that's the most important thing we can do." "That's good, Daddy." Emma squeezed his hand with the fierce certainty that characterized all her moral pronouncements. "Everyone should know that someone cares about them. It's like being lost but knowing someone is looking for you." Her innocent wisdom hit Marcus with unexpected force. In his note to David, he had written about exactly that concept, about the difference between suffering alone and suffering with the knowledge that someone witnessed your pain. Emma had distilled the essence of crisis intervention into language any child could understand. That evening, after Emma had finished her homework and they had shared dinner, Marcus found himself restless and unable to concentrate on their usual routines. He helped her with an art project, read her 3 stories instead of the usual one, and tucked her into bed with extra attention to the ritual of arranging her stuffed animals in precisely the right configuration. As Emma drifted toward sleep, she looked up at him with drowsy eyes that seemed older than her years. "Daddy, do you think your sad customer will feel better tomorrow?" "I hope so, sweetheart. Sometimes it takes time for people to believe that things can get better. But they always can, right?" Emma said with the absolute conviction that only children possessed. "Things can always get better if people don't give up." Marcus kissed her forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of children's shampoo and innocence. "Yes, Em. Things can always get better if people don't give up. After she fell asleep, Marcus sat in his living room trying to read but finding the words blurring together on the page. The note he had given David contained his personal phone number along with the crisis hotline information, a decision that violated every boundary he had established around his new life. But in that moment of recognition, seeing David's pain so clearly reflected in his hollow eyes, professional protocols had seemed less important than basic human decency. The note had been simple, direct, free of clinical language but grounded in the truths he had learned through years of crisis work. He had written about the temporary nature of overwhelming feelings, about the way perspective could shift when pain was shared rather than carried alone. Most importantly, he had included practical resources, phone numbers for immediate help, and his own contact information with an invitation to reach out if David needed someone to listen. Now, sitting in the quiet apartment while rain began to fall again outside, Marcus wondered if he had overstepped irrevocably. David was a wealthy, successful man who might perceive the gesture as condescending rather than caring. He might be offended by the presumption that a barista could understand his sophisticated problems. He might report Marcus to his manager, or simply never return to the coffee shop, disappearing back into the anonymous city where Marcus would never know the outcome of his intervention. But as Marcus finally headed to bed, he thought about Emma's words about being lost but knowing someone was looking for you. He thought about the moment when David had used his name, the crack in his armor that suggested the possibility of connection. Most importantly, he thought about the alternative, about reading David's obituary in the business section and knowing he had chosen silence over risk. How often do we find ourselves in positions where we recognize someone's pain but hesitate to reach out? Share your thoughts about those moments when compassion calls us to step beyond our comfort zones, to risk rejection or misunderstanding for the sake of human connection. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply let someone know they're not invisible, that their struggle matters to another person. Tomorrow was Saturday, and David wouldn't come to the coffee shop. Marcus would spend the weekend not knowing whether his gesture had helped or hurt, whether David was safe or lost, whether sometimes a simple note from a stranger could create the bridge between despair and hope that made all the difference in the world. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the previous day's rain seem like a distant memory. Marcus woke earlier than usual, his internal clock still programmed to the rhythm of weekday openings despite having the day off. Emma was still sleeping, her bedroom filled with the golden light that streamed through her cheerfully decorated windows. He made coffee in his small kitchen, using the manual brewing method that had become a weekend ritual. The careful attention to water temperature and timing provided a meditative focus that helped quiet his anxious thoughts about David Hartwell. There was nothing he could do now except wait and hope that his gesture had been received in the spirit it was intended. When Emma finally emerged, still wearing her pajamas and clutching her stuffed elephant, she found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a thoughtful expression on his face. "What are you reading, Daddy?" she asked, climbing into the chair beside him with the casual intimacy that marked their weekend mornings. "Just some articles about helping people who are going through difficult times," Marcus said, closing the laptop to give her his full attention. "I was thinking about my customer from yesterday, wondering how he's doing." Emma poured herself a glass of orange juice with the careful concentration of someone performing an important task. "Is he the one you gave the note to?" Marcus nodded, surprised as always by her ability to retain and process information that adults might consider beyond her comprehension. "How did you know about the note?" "Because that's what you would do," Emma said matter-of-factly, taking a sip of her juice. "When I'm sad at school, sometimes kids give me drawings or share their snacks. It makes everything feel less scary." Her simple observation struck Marcus with its clarity. In his former profession, he had learned complex theories about therapeutic intervention and crisis management, but Emma understood the fundamental truth that connection healed isolation. A note, a drawing, a shared snack, all gestures that said the same essential thing: you are not alone in this moment. They spent the morning at the farmer's market, a weekend tradition that Emma loved for its sensory richness and social energy. She chattered with vendors about their produce, petted every dog they encountered, and convinced Marcus to buy flowers for their small dining table. The normalcy of it felt both comforting and strange, This ordinary Saturday proceeding while somewhere in the city, David Hartwell was either reading a note that might save his life or had already moved beyond the reach of any intervention. During lunch at their favorite diner, Marcus found his attention drifting despite Emma's animated description of a book she was reading about a girl who could talk to animals. His phone sat silent on the table beside his coffee cup, and he caught himself checking it repeatedly despite knowing that David had no way to contact him even if he wanted to. "Daddy, you're not listening," Emma said with the directness that children used when adults failed to meet their expectations for attention. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Tell me more about the girl and the animals." Emma studied his face with the perceptive intensity that sometimes made him feel like she was the adult in their relationship. "Are you worried about your customer? The sad one?" Marcus considered deflecting, maintaining the protective boundary between his concerns and her childhood innocence. But Emma had always responded better to honesty than to evasion, and her emotional intelligence deserved respect rather than dismissal. "I am worried about him," Marcus admitted. "Sometimes when people are very sad, they think about hurting themselves. I gave him information about people who could help, but I don't know if he'll use it." Emma absorbed this information with the seriousness she brought to all discussions about pain and healing. "When I fell off my bike and scraped my knee really bad, I didn't want to tell you because I thought you'd be mad about me riding too fast." Marcus remembered the incident from the previous summer, how Emma had hidden her injury until the scrape became infected and required medical attention. "But I wasn't mad, was I? I just wanted to help you feel better." "That's right," Emma said, her logic moving with the inexorable clarity of childhood reasoning. "And maybe your customer thinks you'll be mad or think he's silly, but really you just want to help him feel better too." The parallel was so accurate that Marcus felt his breath catch slightly. In his note, he had tried to convey exactly that message, that reaching out for help was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness, that asking for support took courage rather than indicating failure. "You're very smart, Emma Chen," Marcus said, reaching across the table to squeeze her small hand. "Sometimes you understand things better than grown-ups do." The afternoon passed with the gentle rhythm of weekend activities. They visited the library, where Emma selected 3 new books while Marcus found himself gravitating toward the psychology section despite his intention to avoid anything related to his former profession. They stopped at the park, where Emma played on the swings while Marcus pushed her higher and higher, her laughter bright against the autumn air. As evening approached and they returned home, Marcus felt the weight of uncertainty settling over him like a familiar blanket. Monday morning felt both too soon and impossibly distant, the next opportunity to learn whether David Hartwell would walk through the coffee shop door or disappear forever into the statistics of urban tragedy. While Emma took her bath, Marcus stood at their living room window watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, David was facing the long Saturday night that often proved most challenging for people in crisis. The weekend hours stretched ahead without structure or purpose, time that could feel either healing or dangerous depending on a person's state of mind. Marcus thought about the note tucked into David's jacket pocket, the carefully chosen words that represented his attempt to bridge the gap between recognition and intervention. He had included the crisis hotline number, his own phone number, and a simple message about the temporary nature of overwhelming feelings. Most importantly, he had tried to convey that David's life had value beyond his recent failures, that his worth as a human being existed independent of his professional success or personal relationships. When Emma emerged from her bath wrapped in a towel and smelling like bubble gum-scented soap, she found Marcus still standing at the window with a contemplative expression. "Will you know on Monday if your customer is okay?" she asked, coming to stand beside him and taking his hand with damp fingers. "I hope so," Marcus said, looking down at her serious face in the reflected light from the street. "Sometimes we have to trust that doing the right thing will have good results, even when we can't see them immediately." Emma nodded with the acceptance that children showed toward life's uncertainties, the ability to hold hope without demanding guarantees. As Marcus tucked her into bed that night, arranging her stuffed animals in their precise configuration, he found himself drawing strength from her quiet confidence that people generally chose connection over isolation when given the opportunity. The weekend would pass, Monday would arrive, and Marcus would learn whether sometimes a note from a stranger could create the bridge between despair and dawn that made all the difference in the world. Monday morning arrived with an overcast sky that matched Marcus's apprehensive mood as he walked to Artisan Grounds. The weekend had passed in slow motion, each hour stretching endlessly while he wondered about David Hartwell's state of mind. Sleep had been elusive both nights, his dreams filled with scenarios ranging from hopeful to catastrophic, each possibility feeling equally plausible in the gray space between consciousness and rest. He arrived at work 30 minutes early, needing the familiar ritual of preparation to center himself before facing whatever the day might bring. The espresso machine's warm-up cycle, the arrangement of pastries in the display case, the careful calibration of grind settings, all provided a meditative anchor in the storm of his uncertainty. By 9 o'clock, the morning rush was building its familiar momentum. Marcus moved through the choreography of orders with automatic precision while his attention remained fixed on the door, counting down the minutes until David's usual arrival time. Jennifer from the law firm appeared at 9:15, looking more exhausted than usual and ordering an extra shot in her Americano. Robert from accounting followed his predictable pattern, fumbling through his explanation of the cream-to-coffee ratio that Marcus knew by heart. 9:30 passed without David's appearance. Then 9:40. Marcus felt his chest tighten as the minutes accumulated beyond the normal parameters of David's routine. In 8 months of clockwork regularity, David had never been more than 5 minutes late, and never without reason related to weather or traffic that affected all the morning customers. 9:50 arrived and departed, leaving Marcus staring at the door with growing dread. He tried to rationalize the absence, constructing scenarios where David might be delayed by meetings or travel, but none of them felt convincing. The man who had built his life around precision and control wouldn't simply oversleep or forget his established routine. At 10:15, Marcus made a decision that violated every boundary he had established around his new life. During his break, he pulled out his phone and called the main number for Hartwell Technologies, his heart racing as the automated system guided him through menu options. Hartwell Technologies, how may I direct your call? The receptionist's voice was professionally cheerful, completely unaware that she might be speaking to someone checking on her employer's continued existence. I'm trying to reach David Hartwell, Marcus said, improvising frantically. I have a delivery for him, but wanted to confirm he's in the office today. There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever before the receptionist responded, her tone shifting to something more guarded. Mr. Hartwell isn't in the office today. Can I take a message or direct you to his assistant? The ambiguous response told Marcus nothing definitive but felt ominous in its careful neutrality. Do you know when he might be available? It's somewhat time-sensitive. I'm not able to provide information about Mr. Hartwell's schedule, the receptionist said with the practiced diplomacy of someone trained to protect executive privacy. If you'd like to leave your contact information, I can pass along a message. Marcus ended the call feeling more anxious than before. The receptionist's tone had carried undertones that suggested David's absence wasn't routine, but corporate discretion made it impossible to determine whether he was simply working from home or facing a more serious situation. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine interactions that felt surreal against the backdrop of his mounting concern. Marcus served customers with automatic efficiency while his mind cycled through increasingly dark possibilities. Had David read the note and found it presumptuous? Had he taken it as confirmation that his problems were visible to strangers, adding shame to his existing burden? Worst of all, had Marcus's intervention somehow accelerated a timeline that might have otherwise allowed for natural recovery? During the lunch lull, Marcus found himself researching local hospital emergency departments and police incident reports, though he wasn't sure what he hoped to find or what he would do with any information he discovered. The boundaries between appropriate concern and invasive investigation had blurred beyond recognition, but the alternative of not knowing felt unbearable. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and Marcus's heart stopped momentarily before he opened it with trembling fingers. But the message was just a delivery confirmation for an online order Emma had placed with his credit card, a reminder of the normal world that continued to exist outside his crisis of uncertainty. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus realized he was facing a fundamental truth about intervention that no amount of training had adequately prepared him for. The moment of reaching out, the gesture of connection, was only the beginning of a process that often unfolded beyond the helper's knowledge or control. In his former profession, he had worked within systems that provided follow-up and continuity, structures that allowed him to track outcomes and adjust interventions accordingly. Now he was adrift in the uncertainty that characterized most human connections, the space where good intentions met unpredictable variables and the results remained forever unknowable. Had his note made a difference? Had it been read at all? Was David somewhere safe, processing the message and considering his options, or had Marcus's fears about weekend isolation proven tragically accurate? At 3 o'clock, as Marcus prepared to leave for Emma's school pickup, his manager approached with an expression that made his stomach drop. "There's someone here to see you," she said, gesturing toward a man in an expensive suit who was waiting near the door. Marcus's first thought was that someone from David's company had come to confront him about overstepping boundaries, to demand an explanation for his presumptuous intervention. But as he approached the waiting figure, he realized it wasn't anyone from Hartwell Technologies. The man was younger than David, perhaps in his early 40s, with the kind of understated confidence that suggested significant authority. His suit was perfectly tailored, his handshake firm and direct, but his eyes carried a warmth that immediately distinguished him from the corporate automatons Marcus had learned to recognize. "Marcus Chen?" the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested international background. "My name is James Morrison. I'm a friend of David Hartwell's, and I understand you've been concerned about his well-being." The statement hit Marcus like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears while simultaneously offering the possibility of answers. He felt his knees weaken slightly as the implications crashed over him in waves. "Is he?" Marcus began, then stopped, unable to complete the question that might shatter his remaining hope. "He's alive," James said quickly, recognizing the direction of Marcus's thoughts. "But he's in the hospital. He wanted me to come find you, to thank you for the note you gave him Friday morning." "Marcus, that note saved his life." Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet as James Morrison's words sank in. David was alive, but hospitalized, and somehow the note had made the difference. Relief flooded through him so powerfully that he had to steady himself against the counter, his legs suddenly unsteady with the release of tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "Can you tell me what happened?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he going to be okay?" James glanced around the coffee shop, noting the curious glances from other customers, then gestured toward a corner table where they could speak more privately. As they sat down, Marcus noticed that James's expensive suit couldn't quite hide the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain of someone who had spent a very difficult weekend managing a crisis. "David is my business partner and one of my closest friends," James began, his voice carrying the careful control of someone sharing painful information. "We've known each other for 15 years, built the company together from nothing. But this past year, with the divorce and the business struggles, I watched him disappear piece by piece." Marcus nodded, remembering his research into David's circumstances, the cascade of personal and professional losses that had culminated in the hollow-eyed man who ordered cortados with mechanical precision. "Friday night, David called me around midnight," James continued. "He was drunk, which wasn't unusual lately, but this time was different. He was saying goodbye, telling me he was sorry for letting everyone down, that the company would be better off without him dragging it down. I've heard him talk like that before, but this time he sounded final." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, confirming his worst fears about David's state of mind while simultaneously validating his decision to intervene. In crisis counseling, he had learned to recognize the difference between general hopelessness and specific planning, and James's description suggested David had crossed that dangerous threshold. "I rushed over to his apartment, but he wouldn't let me in," James said, running a hand through his hair with the gesture of someone reliving a traumatic memory. "I could hear him inside, but he kept saying he was fine, that I should go home to my family. I almost called the police, but then he mentioned something about a note from his barista, about someone who had seen him." Marcus felt his breath catch as the story approached the moment when his intervention had intersected with David's crisis. He had written the note hoping it might provide a bridge between isolation and connection, but he hadn't imagined it would become a literal lifeline in the hours when David needed it most. "He read me parts of your note over the phone," James continued, his voice filled with something that sounded like wonder. "About how overwhelming feelings are temporary, about the difference between being alone and being seen. But the part that really got to him was where you said that his worth as a person existed independently of his recent struggles." Those had been among the most carefully chosen words in the note, drawn from years of experience helping people separate their temporary circumstances from their fundamental value as human beings. Marcus had learned that people in crisis often lost sight of that distinction, allowing their current pain to eclipse their entire sense of self-worth. "David kept saying that a stranger had noticed him, really seen him," James said. He couldn't understand why someone who barely knew him would take the time to reach out. It broke through something in his thinking, made him realize that if a barista could see value in him, maybe he was wrong about being worthless. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. David's perception of him as a stranger had been precisely what made the intervention powerful. If Dr. Vance or another professional had reached out, David might have dismissed it as someone doing their job. But a note from someone with no professional obligation to care had carried weight precisely because it came from outside the expected support systems. "He agreed to let me come up around 2 in the morning, James continued. "We talked until sunrise, and then I drove him to the hospital. He checked himself into the psychiatric unit voluntarily, which his doctor says is a very positive sign. He's been there since Saturday, working with counselors and starting medication." Marcus felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by relief and something deeper, a sense of completion that he hadn't experienced since leaving his former profession. The note had worked not because of any clinical expertise, but because of the simple human truth that everyone needed to know they mattered to someone else. "How did you find me?" Marcus asked, curious about the chain of events that had led James to Artisan Grounds. "David gave me your note to read," James said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "He wanted me to find you, to thank you properly for seeing what his family and business associates had missed." None of us realized how close he was to the edge. Marcus recognized his own handwriting on the carefully folded paper, the words he had chosen with such deliberation now carrying the weight of a life saved. The note looked different somehow, more significant, like an artifact of profound transformation rather than a simple gesture of concern. "The doctors say David has a long road ahead of him," James continued, his voice carrying cautious optimism. "Depression and trauma don't disappear overnight, and he'll need ongoing support to rebuild his life. But for the first time in months, he's talking about the future instead of just apologizing for the past." Marcus thought about Emma's wisdom regarding being lost but knowing someone was looking for you, about the power of recognition to transform isolation into connection. Sometimes the most sophisticated therapeutic interventions were less powerful than the simple acknowledgement that one person had noticed another's pain. "David asked me to give you this," James said, handing Marcus a sealed envelope. "He wrote it yesterday, when the doctor said he was stable enough to think about next steps. He wanted you to know that Friday night, your note was the only thing standing between him and a decision he couldn't have taken back." Marcus accepted the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of whatever David had chosen to share about the darkest hours of his life. The simple gesture of recognition had created a bridge across the chasm of despair, proving that sometimes the most important healing happened not in therapy offices but in the everyday interactions where one human being simply acknowledged another's struggle. This community we're building together, it's about these moments of recognition, isn't it? If this story has touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from. Your connection to these themes of human compassion and the courage to reach out to others matters more than you might realize. Sometimes we're all just one note, one gesture, one moment of being truly seen away from everything changing for the better. As James prepared to leave, he turned back with one final message. "David wants to meet with you when he's discharged, if you're willing. He has some ideas about how his company might support mental health initiatives, and he thinks your background could be valuable in ways that go far beyond making coffee." Marcus watched James walk away, clutching David's letter while his mind processed the implications of what had just occurred. His simple gesture of human connection had not only saved a life but potentially opened a door back to the profession he had thought he'd left behind forever. Marcus walked to Emma's school in a daze, David's letter clutched in his hand like a sacred text. The familiar route seemed transformed, the ordinary sidewalks and storefronts appearing somehow more vivid, as if the knowledge that his simple gesture had saved a life had heightened his perception of everything around him. The weight of the envelope felt substantial, containing words written by a man who had looked into the abyss and chosen to step back. When Emma emerged from Riverside Elementary with her usual explosive energy, she immediately sensed the change in her father's demeanor. Instead of her typical enthusiastic crash into his legs, she approached more thoughtfully, studying his face with the perceptive intensity that never failed to amaze him. "Something good happened today," she observed, taking his free hand while her eyes noted the envelope in the other. "You look different. Happy but also like you want to cry." Her emotional accuracy was startling, capturing exactly the complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming responsibility that coursed through him. Marcus had learned to expect such insights from Emma, but they still caught him off guard with their precision. "Remember my customer who seemed sad?" Marcus said as they walked toward their car. "I found out today that he's going to be okay. The note I gave him helped him decide to ask for help when he needed it most." Emma considered this information with the seriousness she brought to all discussions about helping others. "That's really good, Daddy. I bet he was scared to ask for help, like when I didn't want to tell you about my scraped knee." The parallel was painfully accurate. David had been carrying wounds far deeper than a childhood scrape, but the fundamental dynamic was identical. Fear of judgment, shame about needing assistance, and the assumption that others would be disappointed rather than supportive had kept him isolated until Marcus's note provided permission to reach out. When they arrived home, Emma settled at the kitchen table with her homework while Marcus prepared their afternoon snack. But his attention kept drifting to the envelope, David's words waiting to be read like a message from someone who had returned from a journey to the edge of existence. Finally, after Emma had finished her math worksheet and moved on to reading practice, Marcus opened the letter with careful deliberation. David's handwriting was precise despite the emotional circumstances under which it had been written, each word formed with the control that characterized everything about his public persona. "Dear Marcus," the letter began, "I don't know how to thank someone for saving your life, especially when that someone is a virtual stranger who had no obligation to care about my well-being. Your note reached me at the exact moment when I had convinced myself that disappearing was the most rational solution to problems that felt insurmountable." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he read, imagining David in a hospital room, surrounded by the sterile safety of psychiatric care while processing the realization that he had come so close to an irreversible decision. "For months, I have been invisible to everyone around me, including myself," the letter continued. "My colleagues saw my professional failures but not my personal pain. My family saw my inability to maintain our marriage but not the depression that made connection impossible. Even my closest friends saw my drinking and withdrawal but not the desperation underneath. You were the first person to see me as a complete human being struggling with circumstances beyond my control." The words hit Marcus with their raw honesty, confirming what he had suspected about David's isolation. Success and status had created a barrier that prevented authentic connection, leaving David to suffer alone while surrounded by people who cared more about his performance than his well-being. "Your note said that overwhelming feelings are temporary," David wrote. "At the time, I couldn't believe that was true. The pain felt permanent, woven into the fabric of who I am. But sitting in this hospital room, working with counselors who understand depression as an illness rather than a moral failing, I'm beginning to see the difference between my circumstances and my identity." Marcus remembered choosing those words carefully, drawing on years of experience helping people separate their temporary emotional states from their fundamental sense of self. In crisis moments, people often lost sight of the distinction, allowing current pain to eclipse any possibility of future healing. The letter continued with details about David's treatment progress, his growing understanding of depression as a medical condition requiring professional care, and his plans for rebuilding his life with appropriate support systems. But it was the final paragraph that took Marcus's breath away. James told you about my interest in mental health initiatives, but I want you to understand this isn't charity or guilt-driven philanthropy. I've learned that my company employs thousands of people, and statistically, many of them are struggling with mental health challenges just as I was. I want to create the kind of workplace support system that might have prevented my crisis entirely. Your background in crisis counseling, combined with your demonstrated ability to recognize and respond to someone in distress, makes you uniquely qualified to help design and implement such programs. Marcus set the letter down with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the implications of what David was proposing. After 2 years of believing he had permanently left his calling behind, the possibility of returning to meaningful work in mental health felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Emma looked up from her book, noting his emotional state with her usual perceptiveness. Is the letter sad or happy, Daddy? Both, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. It's from someone who was very sick but is getting better now. And he wants to work together to help other people who might be going through similar struggles. That sounds like something you would be really good at, Emma said with the matter-of-fact confidence that children displayed when stating obvious truths. You're good at helping people feel better. Her simple assessment carried more weight than any professional evaluation. Emma had watched him rebuild their life around stability and routine, but she had also inherited his ability to see through surfaces to the essential truth underneath. If she believed he was meant to help people, perhaps it was time to trust that calling again. As evening approached and Marcus prepared dinner while Emma worked on an art project, he found himself thinking about the unexpected ways that life could circle back to purposes we thought we had abandoned. His intervention with David hadn't been motivated by professional ambition or career dissatisfaction. It had simply been one human being recognizing another's pain and choosing connection over indifference. Now that choice had created possibilities he couldn't have imagined, doors opening to work that might allow him to maintain the stability Emma needed while returning to the profession that had originally defined his sense of purpose. Sometimes the most important decisions were made not through careful planning but through spontaneous acts of compassion that revealed the direction our hearts wanted to travel. The note that had saved David's life had also illuminated a path forward for Marcus, proving that some bridges were strong enough to carry traffic in both directions, connecting two lives through the simple recognition that everyone deserved to know their struggle mattered to someone else. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the gleaming conference room on the 32nd floor of the Hartwell Technologies building, looking out at the city where his journey from barista to director of employee wellness had begun with a simple court adieu and a moment of human recognition. The view stretched beyond the coffee shop where he had worked, beyond Emma's school, encompassing the entire landscape of their transformed life. The morning meeting had just concluded, a planning session for the comprehensive mental health program that would soon be implemented across all company divisions. Marcus had presented his proposal for peer support networks, crisis intervention protocols, and destigmatization initiatives with the confidence that came from knowing his ideas were born from lived experience rather than academic theory. David Hartwell, now 3 months into his recovery and looking healthier than Marcus had ever seen him, approached with the genuine smile that had replaced his former mechanical expression. The transformation was remarkable, not just in his physical appearance but in the way he moved through the world with authentic engagement rather than hollow performance. Your presentation was excellent, David said, extending his hand in the firm shake that had become their standard greeting. The board was particularly impressed with your proposal for training managers to recognize early warning signs. That kind of systematic approach could prevent the isolation that nearly destroyed me. Marcus felt the satisfaction that came from work aligned with purpose, the deep fulfillment he had forgotten during his years behind the espresso machine. The position allowed him to maintain the stable schedule Emma needed while returning to the profession that defined his core identity. More importantly, it represented the possibility of preventing other people from reaching the crisis point that had brought David to the edge of despair. How are you feeling about the implementation timeline? Marcus asked, noting the careful attention David now paid to his own stress levels and emotional state. Recovery was an ongoing process, not a destination, and David had learned to monitor his mental health with the same precision he once applied to business metrics. Optimistic but realistic, David replied, a phrase that had become his motto during treatment. The counseling has taught me to recognize the difference between productive pressure and destructive perfectionism. Building this program feels meaningful in ways that purely profit-driven initiatives never did. Their friendship had evolved naturally from the crisis that brought them together, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to mental health advocacy. David had become a passionate spokesperson for workplace wellness, using his platform to normalize conversations about depression and anxiety that might have remained hidden behind corporate facades. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, a photograph of the science project she was presenting to her class that afternoon. The image showed a carefully constructed model of the solar system, with each planet positioned according to her meticulous research. Her message read, "Can't wait to show you tonight, Daddy." The exclamation point and heart emoji captured her excitement perfectly. The stability they had built together remained the foundation of Marcus's decisions, but now it existed within a larger framework of purpose that enriched rather than threatened their relationship. Emma had embraced his return to helping others with the generous spirit that characterized her approach to everything she considered important. As Marcus prepared to leave for his daily coffee ritual, a tradition he had maintained even after leaving Artisan Grounds, David stopped him with a thoughtful expression. "I've been meaning to ask you something," David said. "Next week marks 6 months since that Friday morning when you gave me the note. I'd like to do something to commemorate it, maybe take you and Emma to dinner somewhere special. Not as a business obligation, but as a friend grateful for the gift of continued existence." The invitation touched Marcus deeply, representing the full circle of their connection from crisis intervention to genuine friendship. "I'd like that very much," he said. "Emma would be thrilled. She's been wanting to hear more stories about your recovery, though she calls them your getting better adventures." David laughed, a sound rich with genuine humor that would have been impossible during their early encounters. "That little girl has wisdom that most adults lack. Her questions about feelings and healing during our last dinner were more insightful than half my therapy sessions." As Marcus rode the elevator down to street level, he reflected on the unexpected ways that compassion could reshape entire life trajectories. His simple decision to reach out to a struggling stranger had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, opening possibilities that neither of them could have imagined during those dark morning encounters. Walking toward the familiar coffee shop where he now ordered as a customer rather than an employee, Marcus thought about the note that had changed everything. The words had been carefully chosen but unremarkable, expressing truths about human worth and temporary suffering that any caring person might offer. Yet they had arrived at precisely the moment when David needed permission to believe that his life had value beyond his recent failures. Inside Artisan Grounds, the new barista, a young woman named Sarah who reminded Marcus of himself 2 years earlier, prepared his usual Americano with the care and attention that made ordinary transactions feel meaningful. He left a generous tip along with a warm smile, remembering how much small gestures of recognition had meant during his own period of invisible service. As he walked home to meet Emma after school, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from life aligned with purpose. The crisis that had nearly destroyed David had ultimately created opportunities for healing that extended far beyond individual recovery. The workplace mental health program would soon reach thousands of employees, potentially preventing others from reaching the point of desperation that had characterized David's darkest hours. His phone buzzed with another message from Emma, this time a voice recording of her practicing the presentation she would give about planetary orbits and gravitational forces. Her enthusiasm was infectious, her voice bright with the confidence that came from knowing her father would be there to celebrate her achievements, just as he had been there every day since choosing her stability over his own career ambitions. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his most important professional success had emerged from the period when he thought he had abandoned his calling entirely. Sometimes the most meaningful work happened not through careful career planning but through spontaneous acts of human connection that revealed unexpected pathways forward. If this story has touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from and consider subscribing for more stories about the extraordinary power of ordinary compassion. Because sometimes, the simple act of seeing someone truly, of recognizing their struggle and reaching out across the space that separates us, can create bridges strong enough to carry 2 lives toward healing, purpose, and the kind of connection that reminds us why being human is both a privilege and a responsibility. As Marcus turned the final corner toward home, where Emma would be waiting with her solar system project and endless questions about his day, he carried with him the knowledge that some notes, written with nothing more than genuine care for another person's well-being, possessed the power to save lives and transform the very definition of what it meant to make a meaningful difference in the world.